Defending Israel with David Harris is made possible in part by Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Paul and Lynn Light Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, the Patricia Worthen Olin Foundation.
Hello, JBS viewers, and welcome back to Defending Israel. I'm your host, David Harris. And as always, we have a very special and timely guest. He is Dr. Eran Lerman. I've known Eran Lerman since his days in the IDF as an officer in Israeli military intelligence. After he retired from the IDF, he and I became colleagues for some 8 years, after which the Prime Minister snatched him and took him on as the Deputy National Security Advisor for the State of Israel. He is one of Israel's leading strategic thinkers, and I can't think of another more relevant time to probe the mind of one of Israel's most gifted strategic thinkers. Eran, welcome to the program.
David, thank you for the compliments. I'm pink by nature, but it's okay.
I have no doubt you'll justify them. Eran, there is so much to talk about. There's not nearly enough time, so let's plunge straight in. You've read, I'm sure, the Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Iran. You have some thoughts on it, no doubt. Tell us what your reaction is.
Let me break this, as they regularly do in the IDF, into 3 pieces. One is the core aspect of it, the nuclear question, on which I allow myself at least to leave some room for hope or doubt as to the ultimate outcome. The administration still seems to be deeply committed to denying Iran the path to a nuclear weapon. There's already a difference in reporting as to what transpired in the conversations on the question of IAEA inspections in Iran, whether or not Iran has committed itself to allow it or not. So clearly this is going to be the key issue on which this will either founder or succeed. And at least in terms of the overt position of the administration, this is still a central goal, and it remains a central goal for Israel as well. Having said this, and I started with what mitigates what is generally a highly problematic proposition, let me point to the 2 other aspects, and the ones that gave many Israelis, myself included, a lot to worry about. First of all, the entire framework legitimizes the murderous IRGC regime. And that's the proper description of what Iran has become, now that we know very little about the actual functioning of Mujtaba Khamenei, and we have reason to believe that he is essentially a tool, a puppet, or a make-believe presence, but the real power in the country is in the hands of extremists from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, and this regime has now been legitimized. The MOU essentially bars the US from intervening in Iran's internal affairs, which is another way of saying the regime is there, the present regime is there to stay, with very problematic consequences for us, for the rest of the region, for the stability of the international system, for the perceptions of this group that we call sometimes the CRING, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, as to where the international balance is going in the years to come. This in and of itself is extremely problematic, and add to this all the economic provisions. Some of them are already being implemented, others are envisioned, but essentially it looks like, the Marshall Plan of 1947, but with the Nazis still in power. Not a very good idea from our perspective. but equally problematic. And here I would say I have heard a nuance on the 21st of June, more or less, indicating that what I'm about to say now was also understood to some extent by people in Washington who have access to the president. Let me put it like this. Perhaps the most dangerous element in the entire contraption was the argumentation that the administration put forward, and not only for the MOU itself, but for the urgency in which it was signed and pushed through. And essentially what was said is, first, we cannot open the Hormuz Straits by any other means. And second, therefore, we stand in danger of seeing another 1929. The president openly referred to Herbert Hoover as someone he does not want to resemble. In other words, that it was basically telling the thugs in Tehran that they have their finger on the global windpipe. And this generates, in the terms of the language we use in strategic situations like this, is a slippery slope, a situation in which whatever Iran demands will be just the opening for the next demand and the next demand, because they apparently have the whip hand, the upper hand in this situation. I think this is the reason the president, to some extent, modified his language. Once he returned to Washington, spoke to certain people. I would mention what I know has been a long conversation with Senator Lindsey Graham, and went back to threatening the Iranians that unless they deliver in these negotiations, things will go very badly for them. In other words, and that the US may open the Hormuz Straits by its own force, maybe even charge people for passage, which, by the way, contradicts every tenet of American foreign policy on the passage on high seas from Wilson on down. But anyway, he used this language, I think, to basically reverse the impact of what previously seemed like the creation of a slippery slope. This is more or less where we stand. Israel has put its own foot halfway on this slippery slope in order to find a foothold to stop the slide, by making it very clear that in Lebanon, while we can accede to a ceasefire if it's mutual, we will not retreat. We will not accept a withdrawal from the positions that we now hold in South Lebanon, unless it is in the context of a negotiated understanding with the Lebanese government that would lead to the disarmament of Hezbollah, perhaps piecemeal in a modular manner, in one area after the other, in a way that can be tested and then established as a point of departure for the next step. This is where we are. The negotiations with the Lebanese are ongoing.
But Eran, many people here in the United States, and I suspect in Israel, are also wondering, how has Iran managed to succeed in driving a wedge between the two partners, the United States and Israel, that entered this war together, achieved so much success together, praised each other to the high heavens, and now we hear people like Vice President J.D. Vance and Republican cheerleaders like Jesse Waters on Fox television pointing the finger at Israel and saying, Israel, in effect, can destroy this MOU, and if it does, it will damage American national interests. Isn't that an Iranian success?
It is definitely an Iranian success, and it all hinges on one central tool of policy that the Iranians used very effectively, and the United States government, the president, made a decision not to counter that tool by force, namely the closure of the Hormuz Straits with all the economic consequences globally that followed. This is the crux of the matter. This is what the Iranians have successfully used. Prior to that, what we also saw was the collapse of a plan or a hope, Not it wasn't a war purpose to overthrow the Iranian regime, because if you make this an explicit war purpose, you have to fight until it happens. But it was very much in the background of Israeli and American decisions, that this is what could happen, given the butchery of the Iranian people in January, and that there is a prospect for doing so, among other things, by organizing the restless minorities, which are almost a majority in the aggregate in Iran, like the Kurds, and encouraging them to rise against their oppressors in Tehran. This was foiled, and I believe that there's reason to trust the reporting because of an intervention by Recep Tayyip Erdogan that did not want to see the Kurds empowered in any shape or form.
Right.
And for reasons that are rooted in Turkey's turbulent history of mistreating the Kurds. And this, I think, undermined a key tenet of the entire project. But even then, it was still should have been possible with the military might of the United States to take the risks necessary and open the Hormuz Straits by force. Once the decision was taken not to do so, the Iranians ended up with this manipulative capacity, and we ended up on the verge of this slippery slope that I described earlier.
And why do you think, from where you sit, Iran and Israel, that President Trump in the end blinked and decided not to use force to open the Strait of Hormuz? Was this a strategic miscalculation from day one? The failure to grasp that this could be an outcome, and if so, could be a devastating outcome? Well,
not a commission of inquiry, and I think we will need to read the internal documentation. I'm sure that there will be books. Woodward and company would come up with books telling us the story. But yes, it does seem as if the full consequences of this possibility were not taken into account, and the basic problem, which has been, I think, part of the issue with American decision-making for some time now, of reluctance to put boots on the ground under any circumstances, stood in the way of an effective action on the two issues that could have made a difference. One is the Hormuz Straits, and the other, even more, let's say, daring decision that could have been made would have been to take over the sites in which the enriched uranium is buried and extract it by direct action. And these two, once the reluctance to do so was fueled by American internal dynamics, by the lack of, let's say, sufficient argumentation in favor of the war, which led to opinion polls, which every administration has been attentive to opinion polls, this one not excluded. I keep reminding myself that even Roosevelt, who hated Hitler with all his heart, did not declare war on Germany until Germany declared war on the United States, because he feared the American reactions of the American people. So that's a factor. People have also mentioned the 3 M's, the Mondial, the World Cup, the markets, and the midterms. All of these are transient factors, possibly, but at the end of the day, they have led at this point to what to call it suboptimal would be, I think, an understatement. Having said all this, I want to mention, you did, and I want to emphasize, the one positive aspect of all of this is that in the relationship between Israel and the American element of continuity in government, namely the military and the defense establishment, We have come to a point unprecedented in our history in terms of mutual appreciation, I would say even mutual admiration. The Americans who are here work hand in hand with the Israeli counterparts, particularly Air Force and intelligence, at levels that we've never ever seen before. I will remind you that I came to speak to AJC 10 years ago after Trump won his first term of office. And one of the things I recommended to ourselves as Israelis is to cultivate a relationship with this element of continuity in Washington, namely the defense establishment. And I still believe that at least in this respect, we have something positive coming out of this situation looking down the road. CENTCOM, which used to, shun us, wouldn't touch us with a 10-foot pole when it was established in the 80s and 90s, has come to realize that Israel is the most important, the most significant partner it has in its area of responsibility. This is not a trivial matter in and of itself.
Very important, viewers. CENTCOM means the Central Command of the United States military. But let me again press the point. Donald Trump was so critical of Barack Obama for the JCPOA. He called it on various occasions the worst deal ever negotiated in the history of deal making. Is it possible that he himself, succumbing to the same kind of hubris, if you will, I know how to manage the situation, I know how to deal with the situation, ended up with a deal perhaps as bad, up against the Iranian foreign minister, whose own book was called The Power of Negotiation, and perhaps was even more instructive than Donald Trump's The Art of the Deal?
Well, there's a famous saying that Iran has never won a war and never lost a negotiation.
And that includes Donald Trump himself some years ago, who said the exact same thing.
And therefore, we still face a problem. However, since I am trying to remain an optimist, which is not easy under the
but which is appreciated.
I think that at the bottom of all of this is a position that the president has been consistent about, which is that Iran must not have a nuclear weapon. Maybe people have persuaded him, maybe the Qataris or the Pakistanis persuaded him that they can help him buy off the Iranian project. But if it turns out that this is basically just another Iranian ruse, I think he is deeply committed on this issue. And I've heard this observation. I should say, our tradition enjoins us to quote people by name. So I've heard this from Ed Luttwak, who's a serious strategic thinker. It's the president's experience with Kim Jong-un trying to negotiate away the North Korean nuclear project with this preacher from Pyongyang, on whom he showered unbelievable honors in order to woo him, was an utter failure. And this has taught him that this horse must be kept in the barn. It cannot be caught after it bolted. So I still think he is committed to that. What will happen in the actual negotiations will require, I think, some consistency and of course, our own Israeli intelligence community and others. By the way, we are not the only ones in the world who fear a nuclear Iran. Right. Everyone in the Gulf does, and many in Europe do. So let's hope that at least in this respect, given all other things that have gone wrong, there will be still a degree of insistence in the crucial days ahead.
Obviously, and I'm sure many viewers hope you are right in that cautious optimism. I suspect, however, that from the Iranian point of view, the lesson of North Korea is once you cross the nuclear threshold, you become untouchable. And the other lesson is when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum, it suddenly became extremely vulnerable. So you have two competing lessons of history that are clashing between the U.S. and Iran, but Iran.
Anyway, I think the North Koreans are not invulnerable in that sense, not only because of the bomb, but also because the South would not allow for another war, not even a conventional war in the peninsula. But that's a peculiarity of the Korean situation.
But nonetheless,
we are willing to fight again with Iran if necessary, and if we have any intelligence indication that the Iranians are once again on the path to the bomb, extricating the enriched uranium, rebuilding the destroyed centrifuges, and whatever other activities that we may detect, and they should be aware that our intelligence penetration is pretty impressive. If anything of this kind happens, we will act regardless of what the American position would be.
And I think that's now abundantly clear, Eran. I wanted to ask you more broadly. We don't have lots and lots of time left, but I want to get in a few more questions. Bipartisan support for Israel, which you and I, over our careers, to a very large degree, counted on, is rapidly eroding in the United States. How worried are you about that? And from your perspective, if asked by Israeli political leaders, what would be your best advice to address it?
Well, you can read it in the next couple of days.
Oh.
I'm waiting for certain new data, worrisome data, but essentially just wrote a piece on this question of our relationship with the Democratic Party for the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, of which I'm the vice president now, and making the point that the neglect of the Democratic Party has been a mistake all along, and those Israelis who attempted to essentially put all their eggs in one of the two political baskets in the American political spectrum were making a strategic miscalculation of the first order. The Democratic Party is not lost to Israel. Israel's friends across the American political spectrum are still there. There are even pro-Israeli progressives. Not everyone is AOC or Shidat Tlaib or Ilhan Omar. Or at the other end of the spectrum, Massey from Kentucky, who's now trying to once again raise the ghost of the liberty ship. Basically, we still have a base, we have to work it, and we have to retain bipartisanship. We need a much closer consultation within the Israeli leadership and the leadership of the major American Jewish organizations. We need to find new ways to speak to Gen Z strategically. We need to tell our story in a much more effective way. This lie about the genocide should be, which is absurd. We are feeding the Gazans like no nation has ever done to an enemy at wartime. All of this needs to be put forward in a very effective way. And I should say also, we should take into account real points of grievance that are raised against us, like lawless behavior of certain elements in Judea and Samaria that are legitimate causes for friction with liberal-minded Americans, and we should be cognizant of that as well. And I think a coherent strategy can still make a difference.
Thanks for that, Eran. Last set of questions revolve around, let's call it hope and optimistic scenarios. Do you see any possibility of moving the Abraham Accords forward? And if so, what are your candidate countries?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I think the Saudis have slid away, not only because the Hamas deliberately chose the timing in October 23, in order to derail what they saw as an approaching Israeli-Saudi rapprochement, but also because the Saudis are now much closer to Erdogan and to the Pakistanis, which is highly troubling. So we need to rely more on our relationship with the UAE and to some extent Bahrain, India in the back of it. In the region itself, we have made, I think, remarkable progress in sustaining a relationship with these countries and with Morocco, despite all the tribulations of the last 3 years. Of course, we made a few steps beyond the immediate region. Somaliland is an important breakthrough because it gives us a strategic foothold right in front of the Houthi presence in Yemen. We have the Greece and Cyprus, the relationship that we have been instrumental in promoting in our day, they have turned out to be the base for logistics and for traffic for Israel during wartime, and this is important. Over the horizon, we may be able to have a breakthrough. I am not entirely discounting it within the Indonesians, which under their present leadership are much more pro-American than before. But if Saudi Arabia is the ultimate goal, I think it has receded, not irretrievably, but for the intermediate future.
And briefly, what about Lebanon and the Israel-Lebanon talks being conducted through the United States?
There's hope, for one good reason. The Lebanese who hate Hezbollah were very fearful and almost paralyzed until we hit Hezbollah very, very hard, particularly in the autumn of 24. And by the way, we are still hitting them hard. We have taken grievous losses, and we mourn for every soldier. But the ratio is 100 to 1 of Hezbollah losses. And one of the reasons the Iranians intervened in order to help Hezbollah is because they are deeply worried about the fate of their proxy in Lebanon. And people in Lebanon are raising their voice in a remarkable manner. They're even criticizing Trump for bringing Iran into the equation and weakening their position vis-a-vis Hezbollah. I think that we are, in this respect, we may see some change. But
so there are some rays of
Lebanon,
hope, Eran. I mean, again,
there are some. At the end of the day, we rest on our power, and it is not a negligible element in the combination.
What you've heard from Dr. Eran Lerman is Israel remains strong, powerful, and willing, if necessary, to act alone going forward. The regional partnership should not in any way, shape, or form be discounted, from Morocco to the UAE to Bahrain. You haven't mentioned Azerbaijan, but I would add Azerbaijan to the picture. You mentioned Greece and Cyprus. We can mention India. We can mention the hope for breakthrough in Indonesia, and lots more, time permitting. But unfortunately, time is our enemy, Eran. So I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insight. It's always a special pleasure to see you. JBS viewers, you've been listening to Dr. Eran Lerman speaking to us from Israel, one of Israel's finest strategic analysts. I'm David Harris. This is Defending Israel, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.